some other person's eyes have anything to do with how you treat them? No. All right, then should the color of their skin? No. Should you judge people? No. By the color of their skin? No. You're going to say that today, and this week, and probably all the time you're in this room. You'll say, no, Mrs. Ellie. Every time I ask that question. Then, when you see a black man, or Indian, or someone walking down the street, are you going to say, look at that silly little thing? No. Does it make any difference whether their skin is black or white? No. Or yellow? No. Or red? No. Is that how you decide whether people are good or bad? No. Is that what makes people good or bad? No. Let's take these collars off. What would you like to do with them?
Yeah. Throw them away. Don't use it. No more class experiments. I love what the one kid does with his.
Now you know a little bit more than you knew at the beginning of this meeting. Do you know a little bit more than you wanted to?
Go ahead. Tear it up. Oh, he got it. Yeah, there you go. Bite it. And there you go. Yes, yes, yes. Come on, jump, jump. Yes, Mrs. Elliott. Oh my gosh. So, yeah, she got a lot of mileage from that experiment. Is that right? Yeah, I'll have to go check that one out. I'll have to check that out. So here's the reality, okay? So obviously this issue has been around in our country for a long time, since the 1950s. I dare say this is one of those prevalent issues that's still around us today and being discussed, and as far as like what should be done. Here, take a look at this map. This is interesting. 1954, when the Brown versus Board of Education case came around, these states in green, including pretty much all the Confederate states plus a number of others, including Oklahoma, where Brown was, required segregation by law. Local districts could have segregation if they wanted to. And Brown was in Kansas. That was where that was from. Sorry. Idaho was prohibited by law, and so it wasn't covered in some other places. But I mean, there were some issues with respect to segregation. Make sure you have this in your thing. The Supreme Court said the lower federal courts will handle cases that come up from those states to make sure that it's being changed with, what's the time frame? All deliberate speed. And there's going to be all kinds of various different things that are going to take place. First, you're going to have protests, okay? There is going to be major protests in places that do not want the Supreme Court coming in and changing things and how they're doing school. For example, in some places, the local federal courts are going to order busing in order to integrate. So you take some kids from one area and they bus to another school in order to balance things out. Does that make sense? To balance out the numbers. Of course, the downside of that is you might spend a lot of time on a bus, which kind of sucks. Okay, and so sometimes here, I don't know, that must have been a dead bus, so forth. It says federal government's school bus, and they buried it as a protest. Very creative. Here's another thing that happened. You can write this down. In some of the school districts, they literally are going to, shut down public schools. Rather than integrate the schools, they'll just shut them down, which is fascinating. There is going to be some various different controversies. So, for example, I remember there was this one, and Little Rock, Arkansas, late 1950s. Little Rock, Arkansas, the local school district was like, let's try integration a little bit, just to kind of like try it out. And so there was sort of a select group of, I want to say about 9 African-American students who were chosen. These are like, pretty, it was based on merit and behavior and so forth. So they were chosen to go to Central High School in Little Rock. And there was protest and abuse and so forth. And President Eisenhower was like, oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. He ordered in the 101st Airborne, a part of the United States military, to come onto the scene for the entire school year to provide those kids with protection so that they could attend those classes. The next year, the governor canceled school. Okay, they did that in Virginia as well. They canceled school. They just were like, we don't want to do this integration thing. Okay? Because the voting in that, who was voting in the Deep South in the late 50s and into the early 60s? Were African Americans voting? No, they'd been barred through a variety of different means, literacy tests, poll taxes, intimidation, and so forth from voting. It's not going to be until 1965, the Voting Rights Act, you're going to have the federal government actually have a law that says you cannot have these various different forms of intimidation and prevention of African Americans from voting. Here was another thing. Write this down. A lot of parents, even if the public schools were open, some white parents would pull their kids out of the public schools and enroll them in private school, which you can do. Okay? You guys got this figured out already? Private school, right of association. Can they set up discriminatory criteria? Yes. Private schools can, and they did. They're private association. Yeah. Obviously, they're like, well, we're not going to get any federal money or state money, although, put this down, some of the states, those state legislatures would say, well, if your kid is in a private school, then obviously they're not receiving services from the public school, and so we're going to give you like a tax credit or a voucher or something to help cover the tuition at the private school. What do you think? Kind of an end around? Just like a shifting of what would have been taxpayer dollars going into a public school, an integrated public school, and then have that shift so you could put your kid in a private school that was segregated? How do you suppose the federal courts looked at that? Yeah, they were like, no, you can't do that sort of thing. Okay, so that was getting shut down. It took a while, and it hasn't worked out perfectly and so forth, but over time, I can tell you this, being somebody who actually was in a public school as a little kid, the more interaction and so forth you have with people of a variety of different characteristics, the less it becomes like a big deal, right? So I can remember going to South Arlington to birthday parties for some of my classmates who had darker skin than I. And some of my classmates would come up to birthday parties that we would have up. It was like no big deal. You just sort of like checked each other out, and it was all kind of cool and so forth. It's not like, it's still a challenge. It's a challenge that occurs, even today. Here was one thing. I want to have you write this down. Affirmative action cases. Let's go get into the affirmative action component. And this is an interesting thing, okay? First of all, what you need to know about affirmative action, it's a general kind of government program that tries to help groups that have been historically discriminated against. So a typical affirmative action program might be set up to help, say for example, African Americans who may have been discriminated against in the past or may be getting some subtle forms of discrimination in the present. You understand how that works? Okay? So the way an affirmative action program would work is, depending on how you set it up, to give some extra benefit to certain characteristics, as in your race, when it comes to admission into schools, or acceptance into scholarships, hiring into positions. Do you understand that? Okay? Because the idea is, it's like, well, you can't outright discriminate against somebody, but it still could sort of kind of happen. So notice this. Make sure you have this about affirmative action programs. If a state wants to do it, it can. If they don't, then they don't. Those programs were set up initially to help people who had been discriminated, in fact, in their education. Do you understand that? So if you say to somebody who's an African American who graduates from an inferior school, well, sorry about that, you know. Maybe you can give them a little bit of a heads up and maybe a little bit more job advancement and so forth. But of course, write this down. You can figure this out. What is going to be one of the big complaints about affirmative action programs? That in order to help out a particular group, you are, yeah, it is a discrimination. So, and it was fascinating because there was a man, we'll go ahead and give you, why did I even bother picking that up? Here we go. There was a man in the 1976, a white man trying to get into limited number of spots for medical school. Hang on just a sec. For medical school, and then we'll be done. And he just missed out on getting one of the spots that had been set up as a quota for an African American. He had higher scores, but he missed out on that. The Supreme Court ruled in his favor. You can do affirmative action, but you can't set it up very strictly with quotas. We'll come back to this issue in equal protection and so forth because there's a little bit more that we need to kind of unpack about this, and we'll do that. Yeah, and then we'll get into gender discrimination. Oh my gosh, one of the big gender discrimination cases came out of Idaho. What? Anyway, we'll wrap up on racial discrimination, affirmative action next time. Okay? Wipe her down and head on out.